Philosophy of History, Part 2, Figures, Part 2. Another person I want to mention is the Venerable Bede. His book, his magnus opus, History of the English People. He lived in England about the 8th century AD, so about 700 AD, so about, 1400 years ago. And what is interesting about the Venerable Bede, he continues this tradition of, what is history? It is the study of the past. It is the study of written records. It is, and then for ancient people a long time ago, the mixing of myth, legend, and history. Not that modern day historians don't also mix myth, history, and legend too. They do. They don't. They just aren't. They just deny it. But the like Thucydides and Herodotus, Eusebius, and others. When you're studying the past, that line of, you're trying to set down what actually happened, and then how do you know? How do you know what actually happened? You have to go off of what people say, written records, personal experiences. The problem is Bede is writing about people who lived hundreds of years before he did. And so you're gathering the sources as best you can and putting it down in a story form or a narrative form that is quote-unquote true. In another video, I'll kind of talk about that idea of truth. So some examples of his History of the English People. The foundation of our King Arthur story comes from him. And so he's influential in that way, what is the historical King Arthur? Did he exist? Did he not exist? Is he completely made up? Is it completely legend? And so the Venerable Bede, kind of this foundational story of King Arthur. Going into the 19th century, more current day historian or historiographical study is a guy named Ranke, 19th century Germany, so 150 years ago. Ranke was big on professionalizing history, and so for the current day field of history study, Ranke is an example of professionalizing, quote unquote, modernizing the study of history. Separating fact from fiction, separating myth, legend, and history. What is true, what is real. And Ranke really devoted this idea of history as a scientific endeavor. You're finding the laws of human nature in history. Because when you study history, what are you studying? You're studying human beings. And so what can you interpret or gather about the laws of nature, human nature from them? He was big on primary documents speaking for themselves. That's what separates history from the fiction and nonfiction section of the library. You know what I mean? What puts history in the nonfiction section? Primary documents. And so big on the records, the documents, and so you don't insert yourself too much. You don't make it up, and so you create a narrative that is based on what the primary documents explicitly say. One interesting story about Ranke is he envisioned writing one book on the history of the world, and that would be the book. That would be the book on what happened in the past. And so that was kind of his interesting goal. That, if, history's just the facts, and so you have to write them down, and really there just needs to be one book, the history of the world. And so that was his interesting project, and that leads to a lot of philosophical discussions on, is it just the facts? How interpretive is it? What if you interpret the facts differently? Different points of view. And so his idea of the history of the world really delves into what it means to study history. Is it purely the facts? Is it interpretive? Should there only be one book on one topic, right? Like, should the library only have one book on the Civil War and not 1,000 like there are? And so, Ronca's also one last thing about Ronca is the current day seminar style of graduate school is based on him. His idea of the seminar process of studying the humanities or social sciences or history. It's still used today. It's how when you take a graduate school class, like in history, it's what it is. You sit around, you read the text, you read the documents, and you discuss, what the facts are. You hash out what the facts are and what the interpretations are.